Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
The point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem. The infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief? So, welcome to another episode of the Athens Jerusalem podcast. This time we're gonna discuss if religious study have something to do with well-being. Who want to start?
Well, I'll start because I ran across in my Facebook feed this fantastic quotation by Jean-Paul Sartre about the human condition, or what he takes to be the human condition, which I think is a great starting point because it contrasts with another way of thinking about meaning and well-being, neither of which I think are viable options today. So we need to look for a third path forward. But Sartre's idea from this quotation, I'll just read parts of it. But he says that that man is alone, left alone on earth in the middle of his infinite responsibilities, with neither help nor succor, with no other goal but the one he will set for himself, with no other destiny but the one he will forge on this earth. It is this certainty, this intuitive understanding of his situation that we call despair. You can see that it is no fine romantic frenzy, but the sharp and lucid consciousness of the human condition. And this statement is, I think, also indicative of the modern materialistic position, that essentially there is no larger purpose in the universe. It essentially can be described accurately as atoms in the void acting according to these mathematical principles. And Sartre's position is that when one truly internalizes this, one reaches this point of despair at contemplating our essential aloneness in the universe. And from that, he tries to extract an optimistic philosophy of our then taking the next step of taking charge of our own destiny, realizing that no one is giving us anything, that we have no rights, that we're not owed anything, and that we have to just make something out of nothingness, basically. And this way of looking at the universe, which starts from despair and loneliness, is it seems to me to be a part of this great mental health crisis that the world is in the midst of, a crisis that has been precipitated in part by this draining of meaning, this draining of traditional religious values from the world, and we're left with this landscape of smoldering ruins of loneliness and despair. But the problem is the alternative that we think, the only alternative to this is the alternative of that loneliness, that being filled with an active personal God, a God of history, a God who intervenes in history, a being outside space and time who yet somehow knows us and cares about us personally, who answers our prayers and works miracles and so forth, that being the traditional concept that staves off that loneliness of the universe. with this assurance that we're not alone. But that assurance is something which modern man also finds, I think, difficult in light of all the lessons of modernity and the success of the scientific project, that it's impossible for many to think of ourselves as being in the embrace of a supernatural being. So is there a third alternative? Is there a way for us to think of the human condition that affirms that we are not alone, that opposes this idea of existential despair, opposes the aloneness, assures us that we do have a ground of well-being and a ground of belonging in the universe, without having to place that sense of belonging in the hands of a being that most people can no longer believe in. And that's where I think we find things like these beautiful quotations from Einstein that we were looking at in our last episode. One of which says the soul given to each of us is moved by the same living spirit that moves the universe. Or I like to experience a universe as one harmonious whole. Every cell has life. Matter too has life. It is energy solidified. And these sorts of considerations assure us that we are at all times in the presence of the divine, not the divine as a supernatural being interposing in the rule of the universe, but rather a divine which is part of the interconnectedness of things, that our consciousness is a fragment of that divine, or a ray of that divine, that we all dance to this mysterious tune of that sacredness that lies within all things. This is a way of thinking about the divine, which is more immanent than transcendent, which is something which arises from within our hearts rather than something which is outside and interposed upon the universe. I wonder what you guys think about this.
So let's try to explore what kind of well-being these three different, what should we call it, understanding of being actually will bring forth. So what would happen if we follow the Jean-Paul Sartre understanding of being and understanding of man? I think because that's one of the I think that's one of the reasons actually why we started this podcast, and why we believe that that there are problems or challenges in the world if we try to understand being as something as a nihilistic position. Then okay, so what kind of well-being, what kind of possibility do human have?
I hope I'm not being over general if I claim that the notion of well-being that tends to arise from the kind of nihilism that's the starting point for existentialism is a well-being that tends to be more focused on the self. It's, for instance, Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, of the okay, there's no meaning in the world, and so I have to take charge myself and overcome. And this is a sense of meaning which is, I think, more focused on the self vis-a-vis more traditional religious conceptions of meaning, in which our personal well-being is not so much a function of our achieving personal self-realization, but rather in focusing our attention beyond our own selves to the well-being of others. And that other-centered focus, which is one of the great, I think, moral triumphs of Christianity, as just one example, of love for neighbor being at the heart of our sense of spirituality, places our focus fundamentally outside of the boundaries of our own self. And I think that idea of meaning, which is fulfilled in our love for others and in service for others, which is so much a part of traditional religious conceptions in Western religion, it can also be that idea in this third way that we're looking for, which is between Athens and Jerusalem. I think we can find a similar sense of well-being in our awareness of the deep interconnectedness between all things, and interconnectedness which requires us to look beyond the boundaries of our own selves to find that current, that directionality of forces and influences that maximizes both our well-being and the well-being of everything around us. What do you think, Kamran?
I think that because I like the way that you're thinking about this, because looking at it from the point of view of the educational system, which we're also interested in, and generally, I think that we find that there are two sort of non-interconnected approaches. I mean, there are those movements and there are those tendencies even within the educational system which are trying to attend to the individual well-being, and these are usually very psychology based, and there's been a lot because at least all over Europe, and I think this is quite global, we can see that young people are experiencing more and more lack of mental well-being, which I mean, whatever the deeper cause of it, but it's manifested in terms of, in ways of lack of mental well-being, and so the response has been to try to somehow provide different ways of therapy, or trying to get them to feel that, well, there is something for them to succeed in, or there's usually in terms of material well-being, or getting a good job, or being able to engage in hobbies they like, or whatever like that. So that is one sort of approach, and even for adults, there's those are different kinds of gurus of human individual well-being, which are very individualistic essentially.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are those movements, and there are those discussions, even again in the educational system, which are talking about things like universal human rights, social justice, equality, and so forth. And in those discussions are done in terms of sociological and sort of general social structures and relationships, usually without any connection to the individual and their sort of inner world. So these two aspects that you were just referring to, Stephen, as being complementary, I think are usually treated as separate. And so it becomes a bit like my dear late mom. I remember when she started learning to swim as an adult, she recognized that you have to move your arms and your legs. But what she would do was she would first move her arms, and then she would move her legs, and then she would sink, because obviously the idea is that you have to do them in synchronization with each other. And I think that this is a little bit, the situation we're facing is a bit like when my poor mom was trying to learn to swim. And the question is, how can we bring these two aspects together so it doesn't become either sort of narcissistic self-therapy or therapy of the individual, or sort of a
social.
a kind of sort of a thing where I think communism really failed, trying to create some sort of ideal social state without it in any way sort of talking to the individual, or showing the individual what individual changes are needed for that to become a reality.
I think when Stephen, when you had this quote from Sartre, and I thought of how each human today, we have to, in a way, we have to be author in our own life. and we have to bring in meaning into our own life. And of course, maybe some of us might manage it, but then it seems very heavy for a lot of us. And I think one of the problem is that okay, for instance, if you say social media, then you could have the possibility to make like an ideal understanding of what you are, and you can present yourself in a way you want to. But then you stop remember that you actually are in a special element. You are you have to swim in water, and you don't. And we start to swim on ground, on mainland, or we stop thinking that we are part of reality, and start to think that we could change reality into whatever we want. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's very heavy, very hard to have well-being. And even that's why in Norwegian in the Norwegian way of speaking, we talk about life mastering. And I think that's one of the reasons why this is very difficult. And that's why also we need religious study, not religious study to tell us how to be in the world, but religious study to understand what world is. Or maybe not to understand, but to explore or to discuss.
And also to religious study to offer us a narrative of human existence in which we are not seen primarily as isolated motes, in competition with each other for scarce resources, but rather that we are in some ways facets of one jewel, rays of one sun, leaves of one tree, that there's a sense in which we are independent from each other, and a sense in which that independence also entails a diversity, which is a beautiful thing and a great strength of the human race. But underneath that diversity also an essential interconnectedness, which we ignore at our own peril, because our own well-being is tied to an understanding of that interconnectedness. I think we could well say that human well-being is truly unattainable unless and until our unity is firmly established. If human unity, not just our unity in the sense that we're all members of one species, which at a trivial level is true, but a deeper sense in which our consciousness are interfused with each other, we can't survive on our own. We have to see ourselves, particularly as civilization advances, we have to see ourselves more and more from the perspective of our interconnectedness. And that entails, almost logically, if not mystically, the need to care for others, the need to love others, the need to go outside the immediate sphere of our self-interest, and the need to forge bonds of unity across neighbors, across religions, across races, across nations. And if we want, we can think about this purely in pragmatic terms, that this is for our own well-being that we're doing it. If we want to think about it that way, if that motivates us. But I think that's the real crying need of the age, is to find a narrative that emphasizes that interconnectedness and that unity. And I think that really is a prerequisite to our well-being.
I would like to, in this connection, to concretely present the life stories of two young Swedes who have become world famous. And I think they to me, to sort of represent some of the central issues that we've been touching here. One of them is the late music world figure Avicii, this young man who in every sense was an embodiment of what our modern Western world considers success, because he was good at what he was doing, he was successful, he was making good money, and he was even greatly loved by people. was extremely popular at a young age. So he was like what every educational system would have certainly wanted to say, like he's of our alumni, or this is a student that we have produced. And yet, tragically, and according to his family, due to existential issues in his life that he could not resolve, he took his own life at the very peak of his success. And which sort of makes me think that our educational system is dangerous when it really succeeds in what it's trying to do. And then we have another youthful figure that has become maybe even more famous in the world, Greta Thunberg. And she was a young girl who in her early teens was actually suffering, and this is something that is publicly known because her family talked about it. She was suffering of certain kind of sort of lack of mental balance and well-being. But because of the support that she received from her family, and again, has nothing to do with the educational system. It's very interesting because actually she became famous by literally walking out of school and the classroom, because the school and the classroom were not providing her with anything that either may give her meaning or a scope of action. But because she received this support from home, she could find meaning and I would say healing from the fact that she realized that humanity was facing certain great existential dangers that she wanted to address. Now, I'm not saying that the way she addressed them were perfect, but anyway, there she had a sort of a cause to dedicate herself to, which was beyond her own personal well-being. And so it's very interesting that a girl with mental difficulties could go this way, and a young man that had everything going for him and had no psychological problems, but deep existential void in his life, could not continue life. And I think this should somehow give us some hints as to what we need to do, where we need to go.
I think there's two main questions. Is that what does really exist? What is being? And the other one is what kind of relation do humans have to being? And I think that those stories you're telling, I think that they both explain. Because they have a different kind of understanding of being, I would say, and also the relationship towards being turns out to, because the way they are acting, both Greta and Avicii, it has something to do with how they understand their relationship to being.
Mm-hmm. Sounds very much like an example of whether we see ourselves as separate beings, separate individuals, or whether we see ourselves fundamentally as part of an organic whole. And if it's so easy to state in words, and if it seems so obvious, why is it so hard to include that in our educational curricula? Why is it so hard? Why is there such inertia, this idea of an exaltation of the individual at the expense of all else, when it so manifestly does not lead to happiness? And there's so many examples of that.
I think one of the reason is this huge discussion has been on in religious study, that you should not preach, you should not try to make any influence on the pupils, and that's very strange, because if we say that, okay, discussions on what is actually has something to do with preaching, or how we actually are being in the world, then of course natural science do preach, or social science to preach. Let's say they talk about democracy as something that is something we all want to be part of. The question is, why is it so difficult if we preach around religious questions? Why is that so much more difficult to do than natural science or social science or, yeah?
I don't know if this is an explanation, but I think this is anyway a way that this could be analyzed, because I think that in relationship to any phenomenon, you can basically have three responses. The first one is adaptive. It means that you accept it as it is. And traditionally, we have had an adaptive response towards religious studies. You know, there was a state religion, and then children were sort of brought up to be followers of that. Then the other the other kind of response is to be reactive. And I think this is what we are witnessing now, that there's a reaction against that adaptive mode. And we're saying, no, I mean, that's brainwashing or that's hegemony, and we have to somehow create free thinking individuals and definitely not let religion be the sort of a force that controls people's lives. And because it is only reactive, the only thing it does, it tries to negate something rather than, and I think the third option is for a response to be transformative. And I think this is the response that we need. It's not, and I think this is what essentially Stephen is saying, that, you know, we cannot like have an approach to religion and spirituality as it was before. So we cannot be adaptive, but just to react against that and try to get rid of it or replace it with something that doesn't at all resemble that, just get away from it. That's not a solution either. We need to find that transformative option. And what would be that transformative option that would make it possible for a spiritual discourse to be meaningful from a rational perspective and in today's world? I think that's what we need in schools.
I think you answered your own question by dialectical, the discourse. I think this adaptation or negation or transformation, I think that's very dialectical. And I think the only way human actually can be dialectical is by discussion. And then I mean not only discussion but dialogues where we behave, or we act like we are giving the argument and the logical thoughts their possibility of blooming.
Yeah, you mentioned transformation. I think one of the transformational things that has to happen lies in our conception of what religion is. You know, if we continue to think of religion essentially in dogmatic terms as a fixed set of doctrines that's delivered, you know, from on high at periodic intervals, that leads to a certain, I think, sclerotic conception of what religion is, whereas a more transformative approach would open the boundaries and see religion more as that principal force impelling the development of human consciousness, that sees, you know, religious perspectives as spilling over into areas of dialogue that we might have considered secular. I mean, Kamran, when you mentioned a few minutes ago the resistance, you know, to teaching, you know, religion in schools, you know, people would say, well, we can't do that because this is a secular society. It made me think of the opening words of one of our founding documents in the United States, that school children all know and can recite almost as scripture. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And that's so foundational to what we think of as a basically secular government. This is a religious statement, though. This is freighted throughout with theological assumptions about the nature of being, about what we are, where we came from. You know, the whole idea that we have inalienable rights is not an inevitable conclusion of say a materialistic frame of reference. It comes from somewhere else, and yet we're not used to thinking about ourselves as our secular government as being founded in some deeply religious idea. So that's just one way in which I think we can open the dialogue between science and religion, open doors to the delivering of narratives in classrooms, like this narrative here, you know, in our Declaration of Independence, which are non-dogmatic, are not favoring one religious organization over another, but which present a vision of being, a vision of human life in the face of being, which offers a hope and which gives a reason for human solidarity.
Yeah, actually, I think this is very interesting because I think there's a lot of, how to say, spirituality disguised in our materialistic world. Because essentially, if you purely logically carry on from the argument that there is no higher force, there's no purpose, that this existence is just some sort of a strange accident that happened, then I don't think there's any logical reason other than very, very, how to say, utilitarian one for having any sort of morality. I mean, the only reason in such a universe that I would like to be at all moral is because that would protect my own well-being.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, if I had the smallest chance of doing anything that is considered immoral to benefit myself, I would do it, because why not? You know, like, there is no right and wrong, there is no higher purpose. And yet, there are very few people who call themselves materialists that would subscribe to such a, you know, nihilistic view of morality. And this is why, as you said, you know, we have even, you know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so forth. And there seems to be, so I think that we are sort of carrying on that whole way of thinking that world religions throughout history have given us. But it's like we have tried, and I think the problem here is that and this is something that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I remember back in the 80s, he referred to in his talk at Princeton University, that we are trying to maintain that morality mainly through legislation, but having sort of cut its connection to something higher, and it doesn't work. But it shows that we still have it. I mean, it hasn't disappeared. And in fact, if it did disappear, this would be a totally horrible world. I mean, because then, you know, anybody who did anything that we now consider wrong could not be really accused for anything, because, you know, like, who says it's wrong?
I often wonder if was the moral judgment better, for instance, when they had a higher God, or was it not, or are humans nowadays more or less moral than before? I think there are. Of course, it's very difficult if we understand our moral being only as someone who's doing it because of legislation or don't want to go to prison or something like that. Then I follow Kant in many ways, believing that there are a priori something before the society that actually are moral in human beings. And then we, of course, we start to discuss what is this? For instance, if we discuss with someone who's understanding our brain, what part of the brain is actually our moral consciousness?
There are those who would argue that the continuing sort of persistence of these moral ideas being honest in your business relationships and so forth is just a kind of a long drawn out after effect of that has its origin in religious belief, but the foundations for that religious belief having been torn asunder and pulled out from under us, we're still living in, as though we've walked in from the cold into a warm room in which there's this useless hunk of metal in the corner of the room. And we don't realize that that useless hunk of metal was the furnace, which only recently has broken down, but the room is still somewhat warm because, until recently, the furnace was keeping the room warm. And we're sitting in the room and the temperature is dropping and we're feeling the temperature dropping and we can't figure out why, because all we'd see is this useless hunk of metal that we never really understood what its purpose was. Let's just throw it out. And I think that's how a lot of people think of religion, is this useless heap of dogmas, which can't figure out why they could have ever been of help to us. But we are still living in its influence, because the influence of those moral precepts last for centuries. They become part of our culture. I don't know if I believe that, though. I mean, I don't know if I believe that that's the case, or if there is some more innate moral sense within humans that would be there with or without a religious dogma to reinforce it. Do we need God to tell us that it's bad to kill or that it's bad to steal? Can we work that out for ourselves? Kant would say we can work some of those moral foundations out for ourselves if we just apply the logical principle that one should act in a way such that if everyone else acted the same way, that you would be okay with that. And that's a logical foundation for a certain kind of morality that doesn't require a divine source. But even that, begs the question of, well, what's the difference between a divine source, the divine source, and the human source? I mean, are we drawing an artificial distinction when we talk about right and wrong as defined by some divine code, and right and wrong as we believe we have derived from more fundamental principles? Is religion a top-down or a bottom-up phenomenon? That's, I think, a point of debate and conversation. Although traditionally we may have thought of religion as a top-down phenomenon, and we're just completely out in the cold without being told what to do and how to do it. Conversely, and this is, I think, part of this idea of transforming the dialogue about religion, if we think about religion in more organic, bottom-up terms, as something which proceeds from an inward sense of interconnectedness, rather than something which is imposed upon us from the outside, then I think in that direction lies a different kind of dialogue about religion, about the relationship between religion and state, about what do we mean when we talk about teaching morals in classrooms and so forth.
May I just build on one of the words that you used a minute ago, and you refer to the word principle. I mean, because I think the way that we teach science, I mean, it's not so much like what is the, as it were, what is the ultimate cause or starting point of scientific principles, but what we do is that we acknowledge that there are certain principles according to which nature works. And so, like, if you step off a balcony, you're not going to go upwards, you're going to go downwards. And whatever, almost like whatever that is due to, it's very good to know, because then you can regulate your life so as not to hurt yourself. And I wonder whether we could also approach what we call religion or spirituality in terms of recognizing that there are also spiritual principles. There are principles governing our inner and our social lives that if we follow them, good things will happen. If we oppose them, bad things will happen. So let's say injustice is a disequilibrium state that will always, at least with time, is unsustainable. It will lead to the breakdown of a thing. Whereas, as you were saying, unity, whether it's unity within the person, unity within the family, with unity within the nation, unity in the world, is always going to have maximally beneficial outcomes. And I think this could be maybe one. And I think actually I was trying to purposefully throw some, or build the bridges between natural laws and spiritual laws, because I think there is this principle of homology that the ancient Greeks believed in, where spiritual laws in many ways are natural laws on a sort of higher level and have very similar kind of a structure. And if we approach spirituality and morality from that point of view, then I think it would be more universal, and that we could much more easily see the connection between the material and the spiritual. I mean, I think Athens and Jerusalem would somehow come closer to each other.
I agree. I think also that we could start with the questions. I mean, what kind of questions do we ask when we give an answer from natural science, and what kind of questions doesn't natural science give any kind of answer to? And those questions we should also bring in and try to give principles on. So I think that if we try to, but of course that there's probably a lot of questions that we try to give different kind of answers from different kind of view, but also that there are questions that we can't answer by natural science.
One supposed difference between the kinds of questions that are asked is highlighted by two quotations, one from Stephen Hawking and one from Richard Feynman. Stephen Hawking said there's a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. And by Richard Feynman, I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. And I think both of those quotations offer us a contrast between two very different ways of thinking and navigating the world, which I think unfairly, one of them is applied to religion in general, and the other is applied to the scientific mindset. And I don't have as much problem with their characterization of the scientific mindset. I agree with it, actually. But I disagree with their characterization that religion is necessarily based on authority or on answers that can't be questioned. And I think one of the transformations in the dialogue that have to take place, if we're going to have a useful dialogue and about science and religion and a way forward, is a way of thinking about religion that doesn't simply identify it with a dictatorial authority of a revealed truth, of answers that can't be questioned. We have to transform our concept of religion in a way that it becomes a living, active investigation of reality, something that is tested in experience, just like science is, in its own way, obviously not with quantitative instruments as with science, but tested in its application in our lives and in the lives of society as a way to determine its truth. I think applying the scientific mindset to the reality of religion is one of the ways forward. But for that to happen requires a pretty fundamental shift of mindset, because I think for a lot of people, religion very much is about authority. It very much is about dogma and about answers that can't be questioned.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the big problem with religious studies in education, in the education system nowadays. There are too many answers, there are too many okay, this is the answer in Buddhism, this is the answers in Hinduism, or yeah. That's what they learn. They just learn. The students just learn, yeah, these dogmas, instead of starting with the questions and then trying to understand by dialogue, but in the real dialogue in the classroom, what kind of answers there are possible on these questions. And I think that would bring in well-being. That would bring in our understanding of being and of our relation to being, that could help us actually being in a world in a good way manner. That's also that's the main idea about moral. Moral is about acting in the world, and not like altruism or anything like that. It's just, it is a question of being in a world in a good way. And of course, because we are part of a society, and we are we have other human or cats or whatever animal, nature, trees we have around us, we have to act in a good manner with our surroundings.
And that may be something that we could next time go deeper into. But before we do that, I would like to take a step back in relation to something that you said, Knut Ove, because I think that a limiting factor both for scientific and religious education is that traditionally, at least in schools, they both are taught for reasons of gaining control over the world that surrounds us. So the important thing in schools is to learn the right answers. Whereas one of the things that Einstein says about science and about knowledge, which I think is very, very important, is that actually the greatest aspect of knowledge, and where science and religion both can be instrumental, is the sense of awe and recognition of mystery. It's not being in control of everything, but it is realizing that there is something wonderful, majestic, mysterious that we are part of. And I think that this is something that we should do much more of in school. I don't think kids usually come from school having experienced something like that, because school is all about targeted knowledge that you have to master. And so somehow I think that sense of mystery and awe, and recognizing how small you are in a wonderful, complex, beautiful universe, actually is something that gives you a sense of purpose and meaning in itself. And it's a sad fact that we're depriving people of that. And I think in today's world, because our science has developed so much more, we can really give this experience in a much deeper and meaningful way than in the past, where people basically were just afraid of, that unknown universe that was a threat to them. But now we can approach it in a more, I think, mature way, just enjoying its beauty and mystery.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of ending this conversation today. I think also, yeah, this mystery is also connected to logos. Logos are something mysterious, and listening to actually to go out and not trying to get control over the world or control the world, but to actually listen and have resonance with the world. I think that's, and I think that school could and yeah, different subjects in school could have done a lot in that direction, to bring more listening and more resonance into the classroom, and less control. So maybe we could stop there for this time, and hopefully the listeners have had a great time as we have. So we say bye-bye for this time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.
You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Essay. Nora Juel is the technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer, and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.